The courts have delivered another blow against former President Jacob Zuma. The North Gauteng High Court says he will have to pay his own legal fees. It amounts to millions of rands. The presidency had earlier agreed to cover Zuma's personal legal costs. Deputy Judge President Aubrey Ledwaba says the state must now recoup the money that has already been spent. Ian says Aldrin Sampier has been tracking that story and joins me now. Good evening, Aldrin. Does this apply to all the cases, or is it from this point onwards?
Well, it's retrospective. So you start from the time that the indictment was delivered on former President Jacob Zuma back in 2005, after the Shabir Sheikh trial, after that judgment, after he was convicted. And remember, of course, that he was fired as the deputy president of the country. So that's where the court starts. And it's quite interesting, though, that the court does acknowledge that even before the indictment was delivered, the state had already started paying former President Jacob Zuma, or deputy president at the time's, legal cost as pertaining to the Shabir Sheikh trial. There was 1 million rand that was paid by the taxpayers for the former president's legal counsel to go on a watch brief during the Shabir Sheikh trial, as well as the questions that were served on him by the NPA, that it was taxpayers who foot that bill.
So he will have to pay all of that?
No, he only pays the money that from the indictment, which means since 2005. What we've calculated over that period means that there has been about 24 court cases. And according to the records that the President Cyril Ramaphosa has given to Parliament, it stands at 16.7 million rand that has been spent so far. The EFF is putting that amount at 32 million, and I think that's why you have the court then saying, instead of putting down an amount and saying this is how much the former president should pay back, the court has now left it up to the state attorney and saying the state attorney must calculate all the amounts that have been used to pay the former president's litigation costs and then come back to the court within 3 months and say exactly how they will be recovering that money. And interesting as well, in that order, the court says the state attorney must recover the money, and even going as far as instituting civil proceedings to recoup that money.
Now, what does this mean for him, going forward? It means, should we take it for granted that from this point onwards, he will now have to pay, his own legal costs, even if there may be a case, say, coming up where he could justifiably, say there's a case that hasn't been before the courts, right, that comes up only now, and can he still make a case that and say, on this one, it arises out of my...
It arises out of while I was working as an employee of the state.
Or is it a blanket thing?
It is the approach that the court has taken, and if you look at how the court has interpreted the State Attorneys Act as well as Treasury regulations, it means that any case where a civil servant or an employee of the state is involved in an act of criminality where it can be proven that this act of criminality was not done in line with the duties of that person, then that means that that person is solely liable to pay their own legal costs. So if a new court case or a new criminal allegations come against former President Jacob Zuma, and the argument is that this was not done while carrying out his duties as the president of the country, then that would mean that he will have to cover his own cost. Because the other thing what this court ruling does, and I see many commentators have been arguing this as well as the opposition as well, it means that even current members of cabinet or former members of cabinet who may find themselves implicated in state capture, criminally so, will then have to pay from their own pockets when it comes to litigation.
Well, and then did the court say anything about that agreement that was allegedly entered into between the former president and the former head of state, Thabo Mbeki?
The court says that that agreement is constitutionally invalid, so it means that it was unlawful, it was unconstitutional, and it was unlawful. I think the phrase that the court uses is that it was a breach of the principle of legality as well as being constitutionally invalid. And that's the reason why that agreement has now been set aside. And I see that a lot of people on Twitter are arguing that the agreement was between the presidency and former President Jacob Zuma, but we have to also consider who occupies the office of the presidency. Some may argue that former President, or rather the current President, Cyril Ramaphosa, may not be party to this agreement. But for the mere fact that the President went to Parliament, I think on more than 2 occasions at least, and said that there's this agreement between the former President Thabo Mbeki as well as former President Jacob Zuma, it means that we will continue paying this amount, which, well, from my own assertion, or what I read from this means that even the current president could be found to have been a conduit in this action of illegality that has now been found by the Constitutional Court. Because one thing as well that we should take into consideration, if the DA and the EFF did not take this matter on review, the status quo would have remained. That would have meant that you and I would still be paying for former President Jacob Zuma's legal costs. And we know, of course, that he has now gone into more litigation where he wants the charges against him set aside through a permanent stay application.
Quick one. Has he indicated what he's going to do, or is it a question of we're still studying the job?
Well, from the discussion that we had earlier on in the morning before the court ruling, what we could read from the discussion that we had with his lawyer was that all indications are that they might be appealing this court ruling. And also considering the action that he took after the North Gauteng High Court as well, said that he must be personally held liable for trying to take on review the state of capture report, and that court case at least, or that court ruling, we know that he is taking under review, and I think it possibly might employ the same tactic with this court ruling.
We'll see where that puts him. Well, thanks very much. Alden St-Pierre, who was at court, of course, today, where that judgment was delivered. The North Gauteng High Court saying the former state president will have to pay his own legal fees, and the office of the state attorney will have to calculate the amounts.